Good evening, or I guess good afternoon somewhere. Um, Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March 11th, 2025. Welcome. I'm Jeffrey Morgan, and this is a talk I host twice a week to discuss my experiences on the path of soul transcendence. This offering is brought to you by the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness with the encouragement and support of my friend John Morton, who holds the mystical traveler consciousness, which is the spiritual consciousness that allows us to do the work that we're doing here today. If you're new to the call, the format is simple. We're going to start by calling ourselves forward into the light, which is calling our awareness forward into the light of God that's already present. And then we're going to chant three Anai hues. Hu is an ancient name for God, and Anai invokes a quality of empathy and compassion. And then I'm going to play a video clip from my
You
teacher,
ready?
John. Then I'm going to play a video clip from my teacher, John Roger. And then I'm going to do a reading that I've read before, but I really love, so I wanted to read it again from the Buddha called The Discourse on Goodwill. And then we can talk about whatever you would like. So, with that, let's just take a moment to come into the silence. Father, Mother God, we ask just now, calling ourselves forward into your love, light, and sound, to be filled, surrounded, and protected by the light of the Holy Spirit and the light of the Christ. We ask for the presence and the guidance of the mystical traveler consciousness, the Christ, and all those in this line of energy guiding us home. We ask for the clearing, that any karma or negativity that can be lifted at this time, that it be taken into the highest realms of light and dispersed into the nothingness from which it came. We open ourselves at this time to receive of the blessings that already are, the loving that is present. We remember ourselves once more to the body of Christ, letting go in each moment of that which no longer serves us. We ask for a special blessing of light on this gathering and all who have come together. For when two or more are gathered in your name, you are there also. And we ask for this blessing to extend out to all of those who are touched, all of those who interact with everyone here and out into all of creation. We ask for this blessing to radiate from this moment into God's eternity, that all beings be baptized and anointed in this presence of the Beloved, and that this loving guide us, assisting us, filling us, reminding us of who we truly are. And we are so grateful, Father, for this opportunity to be with you, to know ourselves as the Beloved. And we are grateful in the knowing that the blessings already are. And above all, we are grateful because we know that thy will is done. And for this, we continually give our thanks. Berush Beshan.
Each person, because of the nature that you are part of God and created in that energy field that God has created, because of that, there comes a great responsibility. And that is not just to love your neighbor as yourself, but to love this world as yourself and every being on it as part of God in action. This can only be done when we come to a truer knowledge of who we are, and when we come to that place where we act out of that which is for the highest good, that doesn't hurt others, that doesn't hurt yourself, that lifts others and lifts yourself. We start to have a transformation take place. Each person, because of the
All right, this is a discourse on goodwill from the Sutta Nipata, which are sayings and teachings attributed to Gautama Buddha, some of the earliest written. I tend to think this one was probably from him and not made up about him. I can almost hear his voice speaking them. So, the discourse of goodwill. May all beings be filled with joy and peace. May all beings everywhere, the strong and the weak, the great and the small, the mean and the powerful, the short and the long, the subtle and the gross, may all beings everywhere, seen and unseen, dwelling far off or nearby, being or waiting to become, may all be filled with lasting joy. Let no one deceive another. Let no one anywhere despise another. Let no one out of anger or resentment wish suffering on anyone at all. Just as a mother with her own life protects her child, her only child, from harm, so within yourself let grow a boundless love for all creatures. Let your love flow outward through the universe to its height, its depth, its broad extent, a limitless love without hatred or enmity. Then, as you stand or walk, sit or lie down, as long as you are awake, strive for this with a one-pointed mind. Your life will bring heaven to earth. All right, what do y'all want to talk about today? I'm going to post the link in the chat. Oh, wait, somebody found it. Good. Didn't do any prep, so. Natasha.
Hey, Jeffrey. Hi.
Hi.
Um, I listened to a JR seminar last night where he talked about the energy. And so my question is going to be about this to make sure I understood it correctly and see what, if anything, you can say about this. but that there is a divine energy coming down from spirit before the time of the Christ. And then when the Christ came onto the planet, the energy started going up. And the way that I understood it, the way that I'm remembering this, what JR was saying, is that the energy is currently going both down and up. And what happens is that sometimes we get caught up in both streams, which can create a dissonance in consciousness. As we're working to go up, if we have, for example, incomplete cycles of action or some other negativities in our that we're working on our consciousness or not working, there can be a conflict. So I'm wondering if I understood that correctly and if there's anything you can add or share about that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, if you have the name of the seminar, that could be useful to share with the group so they can nerd out and watch it themselves.
Yes, I'll look it right up. It was it was actually Meditation of the Christ is what it's called. And so JR speaks about all of this for the first like 35 minutes, and then at the end of that is the meditation itself.
Right. Well, as per usual, I'll speak to my experience. I can't really speak to what JR was saying because only really JR can speak to what JR was saying, but I'll say this. Um, we know that out of God comes all things. And within this issuance, there was a pattern of creation set up. And in order for creation to happen, the non-magnetic or spiritual light had to step down and express in a polarized form that we would call magnetic light. And when you talk about going up or going down or going right or going left or those things, that really only exists in the magnetic light. On the spiritual levels, I've never really experienced direction in that way.
Hmm.
I've experienced in the spiritual levels something like a different texture or a different viscosity, but that's a different experience than I think what you're talking about. So you kind of mock up a spatiotemporal metaphor or something, or your understanding, which is spirit then expresses into creation. The structure of creation is created, and then these things called souls, which essentially is a simulated individuation of the ocean of love and mercy, or the soul realm, or the Lord of the soul realm. So it's in a sense a fractal of that that expresses in and gives the experience of life and the experience within the creation pattern. So inevitably at the beginning of creation and during the process of ensoulment and the process by which life was given to the structure and evolutionary structure of creation, that was in a sense a coming down of a stepping down of the energy into that expression, and sheaths were applied to that beingness as it took form. You can also read about this. There's a book, The Journey of the Soul,
Mhm.
that could be useful for that. Now, the tricky part about the system that was put in place at that time was it was put in place in an evolutionary structure that limited choice to choices within the field of causality and particularly within the field of that creation pattern. So you could have free choice as opposed to free will. You could have free choice within a field, but largely your decision making, your process would lead you back into the cycle of transmigration and acquisition of debt, essentially. So you could get in, but you couldn't get out. It was like this labyrinth in a sense, or more like a maze, like a corn maze or something. My experience of a lot of what the Christ did was to build a bridge. And that bridge is allows us to reach into, or let's say, reach back into an authentic expression of the soul within us. and then beyond that into the outer kingdom of heaven through the golden thread and follow that trail of energy or the sound current, and then enter back into the soul realm through the rotating passage or there's a lot of terms for it. Um, but the point of that process is it is accurate that there was an original incarnation process by which your soul left the soul realm. But then there was a re-embodiment process by which that unit of that energy unit was trapped within a cycle of transmigration. And the liberation that was put in place through the action of the Christ, through the life pattern of Jesus, allows a return motion, not a return that has to pay every last debt through a series of evolution and deterministic processes. It is an inborn right to claim divine heritage and return by way of the sound current. On a practical level, I think the thing that you're talking about, so that's me talking about it more esoterically and cosmically. But on a very practical level, in the work that we do in the movement of spiritual inner awareness, I very much look at the initiation process and the process of spiritual exercises as a reaching in and up and out. So it's very much about that return trip. And then that sort of beautiful complementary flow going the other direction, I would look at as ministry, where we go out into the world ministering to all.
Mm-hmm.
And the operative term being going out into the world. And there's a way in which we become an anchor point. And sometimes I feel like being an initiate and holding an initiation, holding that anchor point for the energy of the spiritual light to come forward and express into the magnetic light field is itself one of the highest ministries on the planet. So it's always interesting to me when you find somebody who's initiated who doesn't want to be a minister, because in point of fact, just by holding that consciousness and holding that on the planet and chanting their tone and doing all that stuff, that's a great service for the planet. But for me, there is a bidirectional energy flow, especially to the extent that our, while we, in a sense, we don't forsake, but we release ourselves from the desire level and the attachment level to the lower self in reaching up to be more identified, and then beyond that to be more spiritually identified or spirit identified. There's, in a sense, a forsaking of the physical. And yet there's a way in which the Christ or the beloved will come back down through and start to transform the consciousness. And then the consciousness becomes a vehicle by which that beloved expresses onto the planet. And you
Mm-hmm.
become like a living prayer answered. And that it's interesting because on the one hand, we talk about the importance of service to the spiritual process, but it's almost like a chicken and egg question, because when the loving or the beloved comes down into the consciousness, step down from the spiritual majesty of it and starts to fill the consciousness, the only reasonable reaction to that is gratitude and then a need to express that overflow. It's like you're going to explode if you don't give it out.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts to fill you. And the idea of not giving it out feels almost painful. So
Mm-hmm.
you end up going to do this thing called service, but people would look at it, but oh my God, that person is really of service. But you don't really necessarily consciously see it that way. You just see it as cooperating with the flow of the spirit, which is what got you to where you are anyway. So I do have that experience of a bidirectional expression. Now, I don't experience those as in any way in conflict. And this is where I was saying we are talking about the cosmic theory of the Christ action that I try to put words on it and inherently lie about. But there are dynamics of soul progression that happen called, centrifugal and centripetal force. So on the one hand, in your mind, you're mocking up like an up and a down, but what it actually looks more like is a wheel and a spiral. If I had to put a shape and a form on all of it, you spiral in and up. It's like a spiral, golden spiral staircase, or you spiral out into the world. And so it's very interesting on within the context of the karmas that we have. We can have friends and people that we know, and you're kind of on your way out of creation, and they're on their way into creation, and you kind of say hi on the way. And I think it's really easy to get into a spiritual arrogance about that and go,
Mm.
well, they're on their way out and I'm on my way in. Except not one soul will be lost. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And it's really not a worry in that sense. And it really is humbling to start to become aware of just how many opportunities to leave the planet I missed. It's like I can't. There are people who I introduced to John Roger who went, "Oh yeah, he seems like a nice man," and then walked off and never had any interest in knowing him. And
Mm.
that's just bizarre to me. I'm sure there's people on the call who've done the same thing. You introduce and you're like, "Oh my God, this guy's gonna blow your mind. I can't even believe." And then you introduce him, they're like, "Ah, he seems like a nice guy, but I don't know. He has a weird accent. Is he from the country?" You know, you know, right? And it's in a sense, it's already determined before we're born. Like there's usually an agreement. I mean, occasionally grace is extended, and that's a beautiful process. But oftentimes, the people who are going to work with the mystical traveler will come in kind of knowing that. A lot of people in the movement of spiritual inner awareness who I've talked to will talk about visions and experiences they had when they were 4 and 5 years old, where they were already working with the traveler.
Mm.
I talked to one person who's actually on the call. I think she said she had bought like a purple leather coat and a leather and like a purple blanket or something, and for no apparent reason she had to have them. And that's how, and it was like she was like that was the earliest sign that I knew what was coming.
Mm.
I knew that I was going to be working with the traveler. So there's like an inherent intelligence in that process. We don't really have to worry about it. My experience, and the reason I mentioned the fact that your notion of direction and the metaphors you're using and the conflicts and all that, that only exists to the extent we identify with the magnetic realm.
Mm.
So if we look at things in terms of the illusion of space or the illusion of time, then there's a conflict. And one of the most difficult experiences for me, you know, I'm very sensitive to that loneliness, to that feeling of heartbreak, of being separate from that experience of oneness that I would get in spiritual exercises. So I used to get these profound depressions
Mm.
where I would come back in and be like, "Oh my God, I'm still here. What a dump," you know? And it's so funny um, because there's a point at which we get, if we can break beyond that illusion of reference, we start to realize we're both at once. It's like, and I think that's one of the brilliant aspects of soul transcendence on a practical physical level. We don't really have, I mean, I guess you could say the closest thing we have to monks are maybe people living at like Peace Awareness Lab in the Gardens Prana. Maybe. And yeah, I mean you have to do some dishes, but it ain't like the Hare Krishnas, it ain't like the Franciscans, it ain't like any of that. We don't really say renounce the world to be close to God.
Yeah.
In fact, what I heard is something more like the best kept secret is that you're already there.
Mm.
We just don't necessarily have awareness to it. And that's what we're working on anchoring. And I've also heard John Rogers say something very peculiar. I heard him say something like, we save ourselves. It's a point at which we choose that we want that ultimate experience of truth, that we're not going to settle for something that simply placates our desire level.
Hmm.
We want the real deal. I don't think of it, it's like that bidirectional thing you're talking about, for me was more of a challenge when I was more identified as this level, this person, this whatever. When we are, in a sense, empty of that expression, whatever
Mm.
you want to call it, the ego, and we simply sacrifice all of that. We simply say, okay, God, this all belongs to you. Do with it as you will, express as you would,
Mm.
and never find a conflict in that. And I let the intelligence of the loving that is present guide the process. And I don't need to understand how it works. I just need to cooperate with how it works. And a lot of that just looks like breathing in and breathing out, and maybe giving my monkey mind something to do so that it doesn't get in the way of the energy flow, because then you get a rebound, which can look like a headache or getting knocked out or whatever. And we can have incredible physical symptoms when we resist that undoing process.
Mm.
And when I say undoing, I don't necessarily mean, because we don't teach ego annihilation. That's not, I've never heard Jared say, oh, you got to destroy your ego. But I have heard him talk a lot about not necessarily being a slave to the ego.
Yeah.
So what's being undone is our over-identification with the ego.
Mm.
I mean, I've seen many instances where, I mean, Jared's ego was very, very entertaining. He used it as a tool, a very effective tool, in fact. And I love that. But can we care for it, love it, and just see that this is part of the consciousness we've been given to care for this lifetime, but we are not that.
Yeah.
And because I came in with a lot of intuition, I came in with an adept ability to spot disturbances, blocks in the energy, the whole thing. But after a while, I describe it as something like whack-a-mole, where you're trying to find the things to clear, you're trying to find what am I to clear, what am I to clear, and eventually you're going to have to look in the mirror. And then you realize the thing to clear is your own identification with this thing you call you that isn't you.
Yeah.
And when you let that one go away and you become the living love and let that express the way it would express and use your personality the way it would use it and use all the facets of your consciousness, we start to transform and tune to the highest possible frequency, which generally manifests as something like service.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, it's very much something that has to be sought or tried to do or done. And in the end, it ends up being the thing that already knows how to do what it's to do that we allow to express itself by getting ourselves out of the way.
Yeah.
And that experience that I'm talking about is equally as aware, equally as available right now as when you're in a spiritual state. It's just a question of, can you hold that reference point in place?
Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm.
Can I see through the 10th door rather than through the ego, through those mammalian parts of me that want belonging and want tribes and want all the other stuff that we want, or those parts of me that want to avoid pain and seek pleasure? Can I let that be what it is, but reference from the one that is transcendent of that, the one that is beyond that consciousness, the one that witnesses and loves and listens without enmity or againstness, the one that is peace?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
At a certain point, though, and I'm saying this for you, is suffering, any suffering you perceive as your own suffering, and we suffer at the level of our resistance.
Mm.
Anything else?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
God bless you. Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you. Richard.
I've talked to you recently. If you want to do Arita and Ron first.
Okay, I'll do Arita and Ron first. What a mensch you are.
Of
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
course.
Okay, actually, I'm going to speak. I'm not sure if I have a question or not, but many people in my world, including my brother who died, my other brother who had a serious stroke, my best friend who died, my parents who both died, many of the people I know and have known have had decreased mental capabilities at the end of their lives, or even during much of their lives. And I know that this affects both their physical, emotional, mental levels, and probably their unconscious and subconscious, because it is a brain function. So all those levels which we study here were definitely clearly affected. And my question really is, how this is going on? What's going on in the spiritual level, which we can't really see clearly from where we are in this world, in this body? So um, they can't have the consciousness that we have, whether it's available or not. Even if the spiritual level was available for us to be seen clearly, um, what's going on the spiritual level when all this is going on in the body and in the mind? Does it make any sense to you?
Somewhat. You have a few assumptions in there that I don't find to be true. So maybe I'll start with that. Um, you mentioned that the unconscious and subconscious are physical phenomena, or kind of implied that, so they would be affected. I don't find that to be the case. I can't find memory. Well, let me put it this way. This way. Um, Memory seems to exist in a lot of places, both energetically and physically. So it's a collective process. And the mental process occurs in a variety of places as well. There is the neurological function, which is the way that it's expressed in the physical level through the body, but a lot of mental processes will occur, well, definitely on the subconscious level as an energetic field around the body, but then also in the mental body, which is more connected to universal mind and kind of that larger process. Uh, so, in answer to your question, it seems like you're trying to organize these experiences according to buckets that don't exist. The physical level is a spiritual level, and the physical level is not disconnected from all other spiritual levels. It is simply a denser expression of the same God form. It's not, it's not separate from the one God that we all are. So I don't, uh, so from that perspective, and how can I say this? You seem to have framed the process as a kind of a defect to function, that something went wrong or something was broken, and how does that affect the spiritual level or something like that?
Yes.
It's in the framing. It's in how you framed it. Almost all physical experiences exist within a karmic field. They do not happen, and there are several John Rogers seminars where he goes about this in depth. Let's talk about even like if somebody tries to commit suicide, but they don't have a window to die, the gun will misfire, or it'll ricochet off their skull, or somebody will stop them, or they'll miss and it'll bounce. It's like if it's not karmically permissible, it's not going to happen. So that's number one. So if somebody has something like a stroke or something that goes on, it had to have been permitted as part of the agreement the soul made with the high self and the basic self in terms of how to fulfill karmas within the life pattern. That's number one. Now, there can be multiple windows. You can have a window to die here, a window to die here, a window. You can have a window for a health issue here. To a large extent, my experience of the karma is energetically indiscriminate. It doesn't care how it's fulfilled, which is a lot of the reason why, if we practice the spiritual exercises and we do the spiritual stuff that we know works, oftentimes we will in fact fulfill the karma, but we can fulfill it through the mystical traveler's action, or we can fulfill it through spiritual exercises, or we can fulfill it through service, or we can fulfill it. There's a lot of, it's not a substitution, it's just that the incomplete energy of karma is indiscriminate. It doesn't care how it meets the requirement. So that's number one. If it happened, it's supposed to happen. Sorry. So the second level is within the field of karma, there are often necessary experiences and optional experiences. So, for example, you may have a window to have a health issue, and you may have a karmic pattern in the psychic genetic level that seeks completion through a brain aneurysm or a stroke or a you fill in the blank. That will that can be addressed either energetically or physically, and and thus a different experience will occur that isn't that fulfills that karma. The other situation that I have seen is oftentimes people who are on the spiritual path. Now, you were talking about people who weren't necessarily spiritually awake, but let me just start with people who are tied into the spiritual process in a more aware way. I mean, everybody's in the movement of spiritual inner awareness in the universal sense, but those who are consciously participating in the movement of spiritual inner awareness, let's say. I've seen this one. The spirit has so karma needs to be fulfilled, but soulic evolution, expression, learning is also another purpose that is fulfilled, especially when our karma is under the jurisdiction of the mystical traveler. So what will often happen is, as part of the learning process, someone will agree to participate and anchor a certain form of light or to experience a certain level of spirit, but their ego, mind, emotional identification is incompatible with that. And so they're given windows. They have a dream, they have an experience that says, hey, you really got to work on that ego. You really got to let go of those. You're very positioned. You got to watch out, got to watch out. After a certain point, the time's up, the karma takes place, the basic self gets involved, the high self gets involved and goes, okay, well, you're not willing to let go of your ego position and your story and your righteousness, so we're going to dismantle your ego for you. You're welcome. And part of dismantling the ego can be things like reduced brain function. Part of dismantling the ego can also be things like loss of memory. So I know people who've had the loss of memory experience, but their consciousness got fantastic to be around. I mean, like they had the experience and they barely remember me, but then I'm like, I really like being around you now. So you kind of look at it and you go, okay, things that we look at as a catastrophe from the ego story of our life are actually potentially an upgrade from a spiritual perspective. So it just depends what level you're looking. If you're looking at a homeostasis cellular level, maybe you go, uh-oh, that's not good. But if you're looking at a spiritual perspective, you might go, It's a really effective way to get the ego out of the way. Good job. So that can happen as well. The physical experiences, and this kind of goes back to something I said before. When you talk about people having reduced brain function at the end of their life, there was an assumption in your comment that that wasn't simply fulfilling a specific type of karma they needed to fulfill by doing that. And the truth is, in most cases, that is in fact what's going on. Now, there are cases where an individual will be in a coma, kind of held, and it'll fulfill a certain type of karma around not moving around. It's like you'll see in someone's karmic field either imprisonment or monastery, and they can choose which one. It doesn't really matter. So if the person has something around being out of the body and staying still for long periods of time, and there are a variety of ways of getting there, either you become a skilled meditator or you go into a coma, the person then goes into a coma. Again, the karma doesn't care. And largely, the soul, it's not that the soul doesn't care, it's that it's an impersonal, perfect self. So it looks at it and just goes, oh, that's really good experience. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just it's experience. And it's going to take the good in that and leave the rest to God. So somebody having now somebody can make decisions at the end of their life that can have spiritual and karmic implications. So for example, somebody choosing to end their life before their body naturally ends it and choose to take, say, drugs that will artificially shut down the systems of the body. Now, again, I don't judge people who do that because the people who do that are normally in utter agony. And they just want to, how could I possibly judge that? I know that I must have done worse, at another time. But it does have a spiritual effect in most cases. It's like suicide is suicide, and it does have a spiritual implication. So there are things that we can choose at the end of our life that may or may not benefit us from a karmic or spiritual perspective. There are people I know who chose to not take a bunch of drugs to anesthetize themselves, and they go through a lot of pain at the end of their life. But I look at just the insane amount of karma they cleared, and they just shot up spiritually, and I could feel it. It's like when you're in the room with them, you're like, whoa, this is a holy person because they chose to just be present with the experience that was there for them. Now, that's not to say that's true in every case, and that's not to say everybody who chooses to take a painkiller is somehow avoiding an opportunity for spiritual awakening. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you asked a question about whether there was spiritual implications to physical decisions in that regard or physical occurrences such as a loss of brain function or stroke or things like that. And largely my answer is a lot of it is simply part of the plan. Now we don't like it. We don't like the result of that. But in many cases, it is simply part of the agreed upon plan for that
Okay.
consciousness.
So on the agreed upon plan, if much of the events in our life are preordained by karmic agreements, and we have these windows in which we can choose A or B or C, um, that doesn't seem like it gives us a lot of freedom of choice in this life, in this world, if it's
Well,
all preordained.
it's not. It's not. I said that we have free choice within a field, within a karmic field. Like you can't choose to fly right now because you're subject to the karma of the planet called gravity, right?
Yes.
But you have a lot of choice about how you walk and whether gravity is going to result in you falling. So there are certain things in our life that are fixed karmas. They are not preordained. How they happen is not preordained. It's more like an energy that is seeking its completion. And some energies are very, very strong, and others can just be cleared simply by having a positive attitude. It just depends on the level. So I'm not saying this is true in all cases. I'm saying something as big as a stroke is often something that needed to happen. Now you can do things to potentially mitigate it called health and doing your SCs, working with, and again I said the traveler can often fulfill karmas with the initiate without the person having to have physical experience associated with. I've seen countless examples of that. That's why, I mean, a lot of initiates can speak to this. Like you have that dream of car accidents. I've known people who I've seen car accidents on them. Like you can see it in the field, like, wow, that person's pretty prone to car accidents. I know it. But then they'll tell you, oh, I keep having these recurring dreams of car accidents. And you realize that the traveler's working with them to complete their car accident karma in a way that doesn't physically affect them. What a blessing. But that does not in any way deny the potency, efficacy, or reality of the karmic debt to be paid while we have a body. And I say that while we have a body. There are other planes and other karmas that we can work when we don't have a body. And when we are doing the soul realm and the spiritual light and the soul level and beyond the kingdom of God, then that's not within the karmic field. But while we're dealing with that causal reality, that lower expression, that magnetic light, it's like render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. That's what the body's got to do while it's here. But again, that has nothing to do with your soul is not tarnished by that. There's no such thing as a contaminated soul. It's a contradiction in term. I've never found one. I don't think I ever will find one. But it's just something that's why attitude is such a big deal. That's why I think John Roger talks so much about attitude because we have a lot less control of our life than we like to kid ourselves about, especially in Western culture, where we tend to be very privileged and materially able to manipulate our life, right? We have that privilege and it gives us this illusion of control. So we start thinking, oh, well, if I envision it, it will happen. Well, actually, my experience is things like ideal scenes, envisioning, and all that stuff is more about getting my consciousness out of the way of itself. I don't experience it affecting the karmic field of the planet. There is this thing called universal mind, and there is a way of, Jared talks about programming the universal mind. A lot of the creation is complete, but that leaves a lot of material to work with within that field. So I'm not discounting that, but there is a reality called when I say for the highest good of all concerned, when I say I only want to have necessary experience, that means I'm going to bring forward the experiences that serve my highest good. And that may not mean that I get the car that I want. That may not mean that I get the job that I want, or the money that I want, or the body that I want. It means I'm going to get the body, the money, all the situations that are going to support me in completing what I started and going home to God.
Yeah, I accept all that. That's absolutely true for me. So that's no, I have no problem with any of that. That's true. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you. You really cleared up some of my way of thinking about all this.
What does it still trouble you?
No, it troubles me that people are suffering. It troubles me that I'm almost 73 and I'm starting to forget words and names. So yes, those things are troubling, but but it but I think
Words and names betray us. Most conflicts in this world are built on semantics. Maybe you're better without the words and the names. But if you can remember the divinity that you are, you don't really need any words anyway.
I'll try to remember the divinity that I am and not forget that, no matter what my brain does.
The brain's just a tool for organization. People think I have an incredible memory and I do all this stuff. I'm not pulling information from my memory on these calls. Half the time, I don't know what the hell I'm saying. You can do the same. You don't really need high intellect or memory to pull from an infinite supply of knowing that is the divinity that you are.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Richard.
All right, if we've got time, Jeffrey, first of all, I hope you and your family are well. You had mentioned that you used to have a need for wine and it created, and you realized really what you needed was something to do with taste. You said that you could sort of, I didn't say substitute, but perhaps get a better way or more efficient, effective way of handling something. So I have a situation where I can fast, I'm fine not eating, but if when I do eat, I get more hungry. I want to eat more. So I'm in the habit of when I eat to want to eat more and I eat rapidly. So I'm wondering what am I trying to do with my body or my karma or whatever it is? And again, the reason why I can maintain myself is because I fast a lot, but it's almost absurd. And then my stomach fills and I'm still hungry. Is that question clear?
It
Okay.
is. So, couple things. What I mentioned was more what I was never really that pulled to wine, but what I liked about it was the complexity of flavor. And I realized I could get that same enjoyment from tea, but I wouldn't have the negative effects, which is I don't have a very strong liver, so drinking wine would make me feel like icky. So I was just drinking alcohol is not something I like to do. So there you go. Um, but I love drinking tea, and I drink probably way too much of that. Um, as far as hunger, uh, yeah, it's a tricky one because it's often a moving target, and that if you when you first put in a habit, now this is from my experience, putting in the habit of fasting, like I do intermittent fasting about 18 hours a day, sometimes 19. And the consistency of it, in a sense, I discovered with my body, if I'm too consistent, my body quickly turns things into habit and doesn't give me the benefit of that practice. It just becomes normal and it goes back to whatever it was doing. I think ultimately, the best time now I've dealt with that voracious appetite that need to eat and eat and eat and it seems never end. That one I was able to clear. Now the key to clearing it, I found, is to start checking, testing, doing all that stuff in the moment when it's on you. Now the compulsion is going to say, I got to put something in my mouth. I got to eat something. It's like right there. So it's very, very difficult. But if you can stop and just start going through lists, like if you create lists, like is this in the psychic genetic level? Who's hungry right now? I kind of use a framework. It's almost like who, what, when, where, how, and why. And the who question is really important because it may not even be my pattern. Like in my case, my grandmother on my mother's side had some fairly strong compulsions toward eating. And I realized some of what was coming through was it was a program, like a computer program that was just in my subconscious. And there was this thing about like feeling like I wasn't going to get enough food because there was always this sense of like in my grandmother's house, for example, when we would eat at her table, it's like you'd have to be careful at the breakfast table because she would just take your waffles. It would be so it's weird. It gets wired in there almost like an aversion or something. So I found that oftentimes it's associated with trapped emotions, it's associated with upset, and then at times it may even be associated with the fact that I'm not absorbing the nutrients or I'm not getting what I need from what I'm eating. So the satiation doesn't get triggered. Or I may have an allergy. There's any number of ways that it can be physically caused that the satiation isn't triggered inside of you. But I have found that at least on the energetic level, when you're trying to clear that, that moment when it's on you is usually where you're going to get the richest experience as far as what that is. So it's like in the moment, hit the pause button and start checking. Just start looking at all those levels and seeing who's hungry right now? What's pulling on me? Is it my hunger or somebody else's? Is it hunger that I'm misinterpreting? Maybe it's boredom. A lot of people eat when they're bored. It's not actual hunger. It's like, I don't know what else to do, might as well eat. So it's like going through all that and starting to identify what's really pulling the strings of this behavior and not judging it.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the subconscious, and my father was always overweight, fighting not eating or overeating. And I'm just thinking that might be an entryway
Yeah.
into this whole thing too. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's almost like it can be in the structure. So it can be the way that we relate to food. So for example, if we have an adversarial relationship with food or food is made taboo, it's kind of like, oh, I shouldn't eat that, but I should eat that. Oh, I shouldn't eat that, but I should eat that. There's ways in which it can be wired. And I think what works best for me or what has worked best for me is actually relating to food more on a frequency level. Because sometimes when it's not, well, I find that almost everything works better when I relate medicinally to my life. Conversations are medicine. Food that I eat is medicine. Sleep is medicine. You just kind of look at everything as medicinal or toxic. And, and so I kind of start to relate to things in a more associative or somatic way. So, for example, there have been periods of time where I would go through transformations spiritually and energetically that result in a rechemicalization physically. And then what'll happen is I'll be real sensitive and I'll try to eat the same stuff that I was eating and I'll feel real sick. Like this, one of those happened when I stopped eating red meat. Now, it's not like I was like, oh my God, I shouldn't eat red meat. I'm sure there's people on the call that have like actual really good ethical arguments for why one shouldn't eat red meat. The truth is, frequency wise, it was no longer compatible with my body. I could tell, you know? So it was very strange. I just stopped. But there was a way in which I had to teach myself to eat and rebuild my diet because I didn't know what to eat. And it started to be like, going to the store and I would pick up an apple and go. And the best way I could describe it is just, does it harmonize with me? Does the frequency of this apple feel like it's harmonizing with my field? It's almost like tuning an instrument or something. But it wasn't really a logical process. And occasionally, I mean, a lot of the times, if I really listen to that intuitive part of me, simpler, less processed foods tend to be more medicinal. So it's like eating a plain heirloom apple or something like that was feeling really, sometimes when it's like the right moment, it can be so healing just to eat an apple. But then
and
other
tastes good.
times, huh?
And tastes good.
Yeah, and tastes good. And other times it's really weird because other times, sometimes really weird stuff is needed energetically for me because I picked up a certain thing. So sometimes a Coca-Cola, if I'm really hosed energetically, like having like a Mexican Coke will just like fix it. And I'll be like, yes, I'm fine now. I can't explain that, and nor am I endorsing that as a healthy behavior by any means. But for whatever reason, that can just heal stuff. Root beer as well. Sometimes when I've accidentally eaten garlic, a really good natural sarsaparilla will somehow like make the headache go away. Very strange. But my point is, uh, it never really worked for me. There was a structure and a patterning that my family, meaning like more like my grandmother and like that whole related to food. And that patterning, that framing, that template seemed to be why I was compulsively eating. And I can say, look, I have an ongoing debate with my genetics about how to keep me thinner than I'd like, more thin than I am or something like that. Like I'm always working that process, but that it's not the same as it was in the sense that I don't feel as compulsively drawn to eat the way that I was, mainly because I changed the way that I relate to food inside of me and how I categorize it in my consciousness. And it may be worthwhile looking at because we learn so much implicitly when we're a kid, and it's just the explicit learning dwarfs in comparison to everything we learn just by observing. And I find that for me, when I shifted it and just went totally in that more medicinal, energetic, somatic direction, all of a sudden I just didn't feel as much of a pull. It's like it reset the dialogue.
Perfect. I got a lot to work on.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Thank
Love
you.
you.
Okay.
Thank
God
you.
bless you. Well, all right, everybody. I'm gonna go finish making dinner for the family. So have a wonderful evening. God bless you. I love you. Peace be still. The blessings already are.